Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about deep listening. Listening very carefully to what people say, what they don't say, what words they use, how they craft and phrase their ideas. What is their backstory, energy, and intention? Do you always understand what people mean, not what they say? How often do you check? Are there ever misunderstandings at team meetings that were avoidable? Have you ever considered that meetings could be shortened significantly if everyone listened more carefully and asked more concise questions? Listening is a powerful skill. It also takes practice not to jump ahead in your mind, but to continue to focus on what is being said in real time. Listening helps you ask better questions, address imbalanced interactions, and keep track of meeting progress. This episode also includes some live learning. This is my learning journey too, with its skips and stumbles that I've left in, because I still have much to learn, and if you're listening, my learning process might be helpful to you too. I'm delighted to be speaking with Oscar Trimboli. Oscar is a marketing and technology industry veteran who's worked for Microsoft, PeopleSoft, Polycom, and Vodafone. Over 28,000 people have contributed to his research about listening and the key impediments to deep listening. He consults worldwide with major organizations such as Google, HSBC, and Siemens on his quest to create 100 million deep listeners. Oscar is the author of How to Listen, Discover the Hidden Key to Better Communication. And he's the host of Apple award-winning podcast, Deep Listening. Hi, Oscar. How are you?
G'day, Sophie. Looking forward to listening to your questions today.
And I am very interested in listening to your answers. I always start at the beginning, the genesis of how this all came about and how you became such a wonderful listener. From what I understand, it started way back into childhood. I'd love you to share some of that story.
Oh, in my teenage years, I had a very protruded jaw. My nickname was the werewolf. If you can imagine a fist from distance from your jawline, that's how far mine protruded out. And as a result, most people get braces or orthodontics to straighten their teeth. Mine was to push my jaw back into a normal position, and I took out 4 teeth at once in my upper bite. That was a bit of fun. And first time ever I'd taken any kind of medication in my life, or at least I was told to.
Right.
And when you don't want to draw attention to yourself because you've got all this metal in your mouth and your jaw's a bit protruded, you get really good at being interested in other people. The easiest way not to get people focus on you is just to ask them questions and be really, really curious and just stay in the background a little bit as well. And then, going into the high school years, I grew up in a school with 23 nationalities, and the recreational activity, if you weren't into sport or into reading, was to play cards. And cards were played in teams of 2, and typically nationalities paired up. The Brazilians played against the Polish teams, or the Cypriots played against the Italians. The Cypriots didn't play against the Turks. That was a bit too close to home. It's a bit of war history there for people who don't know, particularly at that time. And I didn't speak any other language, although the son of 2 first-generation migrants from Italy, they married outside their regions and were effectively disowned from their families. So I grew up as an Aussie.
Oh, wow.
And what it meant was occasionally I'd get asked to play as the spare player because someone wasn't available. And the home teams would speak in their home language. The Brazilians would speak Portuguese. The Argentinians would speak Spanish to themselves. And what they didn't realize is their face, their eyes, their finger positions was telling me much more than whatever they were talking about verbally. Although, even without knowing the language, you notice tempo in language. You notice pause in language. So all these places I was not consciously learning how to listen to body language or learn how to ask questions that would get people to talk about themselves. But over time, I came to realize this was a useful skill and actually an unusual one that most people didn't have.
It's very interesting you say that, because I actually recently met somebody who was maybe 10 years ago the number 19th poker player in the world. He's played a lot for 10 years as his job professionally. And mostly he's playing online, running all the programs and looking for patterns, but occasionally he would play in Vegas. And he said that they all put sunglasses on and the hoodies, and they're covering their necks because even that can show the extent they go to in order to cover all of those facial expressions that you were obviously reading and learning. When looking at the progression then of your career after all this learning experience, and also the cultural specifics that you were picking up as you were playing between the different teams, you then went into telecoms. How did that come about?
Look, it was an unusual move because, when my first job that I ever had, my dad always said to me, Oscar, get a job as an accountant. Accountants will never be out of work. It's a good job. And, my dad was very keen for me to go to university, which I did. Dutiful son, the firstborn, always does what they're told. Second one rebels. Third one just figures it all out along the way. And I got a job in an accounting firm, and within 6 weeks, my manager said to me, hey, at lunchtime, I just got a little exercise for you. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So my manager, Robert, read out 20 telephone numbers to me, and he asked me to write them down, and 16 of them were correct and 4 were incorrect when I wrote them down. And the ones that were incorrect, the 4, I had all the numbers correct, just in the wrong order. So I had this thing called dyscalculus. And Robert said to me, in your work as an accountant, you're obviously turning the numbers around. That's not going to be good for a long-term career in accounting. And I was devastated because I didn't want to disappoint my dad. I'd gone to university. I'd enrolled in all these courses. And then about 4 weeks later, Robert's manager, Bill, the two of them came to a meeting to kind of give me my marching orders, I assumed. And Bill said to me, Oscar, what do you know about computers? And I said, Bill, nothing. He goes, great. I love your honesty. I know you're a hard worker. I'm sure you'll figure it out. We want you to computerize our accounting practice. And in those days, we were working on spreadsheets, which were A3 pieces of paper with grid lines on them and green and black and red pens. And I'm dating myself here. This is before Excel, and Lotus 123 had just emerged as a spreadsheet standard. And I was there to implement accounting software. So I started to learn software, and for a decade I was operating in the software industry. But I got a call from a recruiter in the telecommunications industry to say that Vodafone was looking to put more data applications on their network. Up until then, the only reason to use a phone was to make phone calls, and the idea of the iPhone hadn't even arrived, and all kinds of wonderful ideas like how do you turn your air conditioner on from a remote location using text messaging as an example. And I listened to a lot of engineers telling me why that could and couldn't be done. And I always said to them, look, I've listened to some customers explain to me this would be really useful. Which customers have you listened to form your opinion? And they'd often be stumped. They'd often be confused. They'd often kind of be wary of me almost to go, you listen to customers? And in these big intergalactic corporations, the closest most people get to listening to customers are slides with graphs. And if they're lucky, they have little word clouds called verbatim, which is a quote directly from a customer. And in all my roles, I became either infamous or famous, depending on how you look at it, for asking the question when decisions were being made, well, which customers have we consulted? What customer evidence have we listened to form this perspective? And I have to say, Sophie, in most cases, the answer was we haven't. The answer was, that's a really good question, but we'll still make a decision. Or the enlightened ones would say, Oscar, that you make a good point. Let's pause, let's reschedule for a couple of weeks and let's go and collect that information. Now, in most cases, the information didn't need collecting. It just needed to be consumed. It needed to be evaluated, it needed to be sorted, and a decision needed to be made. And the same was true when I was leading teams. People would often come to me and go, hey, Oscar, really like the way your team works. I'd like to come and work in your team. And I'd always say, look, before we have a chat, can you go and listen to our customer contact center recordings and tell me something about the customers both you and I don't know? Again, 8 out of 10 people would never come back to me because that was just too hard. But for the 2 out of 10 people who did come back to me, they would come back with very enlightening information. They would listen to those calls in ways I never would. And they were helping me make our part of the business better without them even joining, which meant I didn't have a problem recruiting people either. There was no shortage of people who wanted to come and work in our team because we had a different approach. We would always ask that question. What has the customer said? What customer evidence do we have? How have we listened to the customer for this? So that's the journey into telecommunications and to software.
And it's interesting to me now that you spent just over a decade at Microsoft. And of course, Satya Nadella now is very much about empathy and listening to customers and seeing that as being the future. I know that there was this pivotal moment where somebody actually drew on your listening skills specifically and shifted what you were focused on. I'd love you to explain how that all happened.
Well, I joined Microsoft the week of the Department of Justice consent decree being agreed. So there was a nearly 7-year court case between Microsoft and the US Department of Justice about anti-competitive activity. As a result of this consent decree, Microsoft was very careful. It was very mindful of its compliance obligations. And as a result, it missed the entire mobile phone market, as an example. The CEO was famous on stage for laughing at the launch of the iPhone, saying who would pay $1,000 for a phone, and missed a $1 trillion opportunity. Only at the last minute to try and buy Nokia and, again, waste a lot of money because they weren't listening to customers. And the division Satya was in was a peer organization to mine, and they were fascinating because they were embracing a lot of the things I was talking about. And I eventually went and moved over there for a period of 18 months to help somebody who was on sick leave, the leader of that group. And it felt quite natural being in that division because the question about what would the customers ask, or in this case, what would the developers want to know, which was the customers for that part of the division, that was a natural muscle for that part of the business.
Right.
And that was quite common. But if we wind the clock forward to a budget meeting I was in, by then I'm a marketing director in the organisation, and we're setting the annual budget for the Australian division, and we've got Seattle on the video conference, and we've got Singapore on the video conference, and we've got people in Australia. We've got about 18 people sitting on video conference or from all around the world. And the budget meetings, they're renowned for going overtime, 2 to 3 to 4 hours sometimes. So this meeting was scheduled for 90 minutes, and it actually finished early. It finished at the 70-minute mark. Now, what happened for me at the 20-minute mark in the meeting, my vice president, Tracy, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oscar, we need to talk immediately after this meeting," which for the men out there is the equivalent of, "Honey, we need to talk." And the only thing going through my head, ironically, I didn't listen to a single thing for the rest of the meeting. All I was doing was writing down how many weeks of salary I had left, what were the big expenses coming up, who in my network could I talk to about getting a job. And as everybody left the room, Tracy asked me to make sure the doors closed. And as I walked back towards her, she said, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And I thought, wow, I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. And I sat down. And what she said next was quite profound. She said, "If you could code the way you listen, you could change the world." And as profound and as impactful a moment of listening as that was on her part, the only thing that was going through my mind was, woohoo, I haven't been fired. And this is important to understand when you're the speaker. Quite often, what you say and what the listener hears is at the intersection of what's going through their mind and what you said. And what you say may not be heard by them because they're processing this in a completely different way.
Right.
And then 2 weeks later, the chief financial officer, the CFO, Brian, asked me to come and audit his listening in the budget meeting for Australia. And I noticed that he was asking really long, complex questions. He was only asking a handful of people. And then I realized I was starting to code how to listen. And if you wind the clock forward to where we are today, we've got over 27,000 people in our research database where people have told us what gets in their way when it comes to listening. We've got jigsaw games. We've got practice cards that people can use. We've got 3 books. We've got lots of assets for people to understand how to listen. So I hope I've honoured Tracy's request in that I'm now coding how to listen.
There's obviously all the different ways that you developed out of it. But as you were starting that journey, maybe you started keying into both the listening and the visuals and some of those things you were drawing from when you're playing cards. But in a business meeting setting, there are different dynamics, there are different people are speaking in different ways. I can imagine that was a very different time for you at the very beginning of this journey. What were the key things that really jumped out first that helped you create the building blocks of this encoding?
Oh, well, the first thing I realized, I knew absolutely nothing about listening. So the very first thing I did was use Google Scholar, try and find the people who were the highest H-index professors or experts in the field who'd published papers around listening and the body of work around, listening in a non-therapeutic context, meaning not psychology and all of that. That kind of started in the 1960s. So there were all these frameworks that none of them were complementary. There was no commonality in them. So I started learning there and I was kind of, okay. And then I started just keeping counts. So a simple thing I would always do is when I was watching a group meeting and I wasn't the host and I was a participant, I would keep account of the following. If somebody asked the host a question, how often would the host answer it immediately or seek to clarify their understanding of what that person was meaning by the question. And again, it was quite rare. It was like 2 out of 10 leaders would clarify the question before they answered it. And the really skillful ones wouldn't answer it at all. They'd invite the group's perspective first. And this is a really powerful. So a good host will get everybody to listen to them. A great host will get everybody to listen to each other. And this was one of the quick things I would notice just by the clarifying question. The second thing I would notice is the length of the question a host may pose to the group. And often I notice that the shorter the question, the more insightful the response that they would get from the respondent. And what was intriguing for me about that was often they weren't asking questions which was seeking clarification from their perspective. They were seeking clarification from the perspective of the group. So the question wasn't their insatiable appetite to reload their gun with more bullets in the argument about why they're wrong and they're right. It was, and this is what Satya talks about. It's about empathetic curiosity to go, can I seek to understand their perspective just a little longer? Because when I do, I may see horizons. I may see opportunities. I may see perspectives that I've never envisaged before. And this only happens when you explore through questions. The other count that I kept was statement to question ratio from the host. Now, eventually I moved to statement to question ratio from the group. But this is where, back in those days, Sophie, that's the rudimentary starting point for putting some kind of heuristic, some kind of code behind noticing how people listen. One thing I will say is I've been really naughty. I haven't coded how I listen. What I've noticed is who are the great listeners that I encounter, and I've been deliberate to code how they listen, because I think it would be a bit arrogant on my part to think that the way I listen is the only way or the best way or anything like that. So for that's where I was at. It was pretty rudimentary. I mean, now we've got it in software and it's all fancy pants and everything. But in those days, it was just a simple notepad and a pencil, to be honest.
And how did the results of the encoding that you were able to bring to Tracy and Brian, what were the insights from that meeting that were able to help them take different steps or make different decisions?
Yeah. Look, with Tracy, I think she's a superb listener. Tracy heard me ask a question that many other people have heard me ask. It's just she noticed the impact it had on the room. It shortened the meeting. It got a lot of vigorous debate to a point of consensus and agreement. And from her perspective, I think Tracy was really deliberate in listening not just to what people said. She was there trying to figure out what did it mean not just for them, but what does it mean for the group and the outcome they're trying to move towards. So with Brian, he realised, and Tracy made this point, Oscar, you know, your meetings are always shorter because you're of this approach. So the promise is really simple, and our deep listening ambassador community, these people who've been part of the research and use the tips from the coding, they often say, Oscar, I get anywhere between 1 to 4 hours a week back in my schedule because my meetings are shorter. Brian's takeaway was really simple. He said to me that his default questioning technique was biased, meaning he had a position that he wanted to forward, and that was one-dimensional. So I said to him, do you notice that, you know, the X% of your questions, it was typically single digits, are open questions versus closed questions or biased questions. And roughly the maths I'd figured out on this, if you ask questions with more than 8 words, typically it's going to be a bias question. If you ask questions with less than 8 words, typically it's going to be more open-ended. Now,
Okay.
beware of prophets peddling false binaries like open versus closed questions. What Brian and I talked about was his consciousness that his one-dimensional questioning technique was just leading him down a dark alleyway that he'd always been, and he'd always have to kind of back his way out. So with Brian, we helped him to go, when are open questions appropriate and when are biased or closed questions appropriate? Because neither is correct or incorrect. It's using your leadership judgment to go, when the meeting is starting, when the project is commencing, when you're meeting somebody and establishing a relationship for the first time, they're probably open questions are going to be productive.
Mm-hmm.
If you're getting towards a decision, if you're getting towards the end of a project, if you want to resolve something, bias questions, questions that allocate resources like people or money,
Right.
these things are times when closed questions or bias questions are really, really productive.
Mm-hmm.
But whether you use open or closed questions, if that's all you do and you're not conscious to go, what does this situation need
Mm-hmm.
from my leadership now, then you're operating from a perspective that's going to make progress for the group. A lot of leaders are operating from a place of unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
They're not looking at the situation from the perspective of the dialogue and the outcome. They're
Mm-hmm.
looking at it singularly from the agenda. It's like, we've got 15 minutes, we need to resolve this, let's resolve this now.
Right.
Yet if some joker like me asks a question, it's like, great, we want to make a decision. Where's the customer data and evidence that we've made? A good leader will go, look, Oscar, we'll get it eventually, but we still have to make a decision. Whereas a great leader will go, nah, that's a good point, Oscar. Let's stop this agenda item. Let's pick that up at the next meeting. Let's move the other agenda item up, because they're listening for new perspectives in that regard.
So digging deeper into this aspect of listening, there's so much more than the conversation, the listening. There's what is said, the words that are used, the phraseology that is used. That changes how much people are able to listen or how much they're able to concentrate on the meaning of the words and whether they really do understand the meaning of the words. So I'd like to go to some of the aspects of the words themselves, but also something which I really think about is what isn't said, because it sometimes strikes me, whether it's hours or minutes or even days after a conversation, they didn't say that. That's really interesting. So how do you bring some of these pieces together? Because there are many of them.
Yeah, and it's a really long question with many parts in it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
Where would you like to start? It's just a really good practical example of,
yes,
if the person who's hearing that just answered the question, which is a huge temptation, and my ego knows, of course I know the answer, Sophie. Let me answer it. Yet my orientation is on you listening right now. Those wonderful people who are listening to this podcast. So I'd love to break that down in a way that's helpful for them as well as us.
Yes. I'm so delighted that I serve as such a perfect example of how not to ask a question. Okay. How do you... Oh, I've got to keep it to less than 8 words.
No. Please don't jump to that conclusion.
Okay.
Maybe just think of it as one question, because there was at least 3 questions in what you asked previously.
I know. What are the key components of listening to understand first?
So research has shown us there's 5 levels of listening.
Okay.
And I'll just give you the labels for each of them and a quick explanation. So the 5 levels, first is listen to yourself. Next, listen to the content, what they say, what you sense, and what you hear. So what you sense is their emotion, as an example. Level 3 is listen for the context. This is the backstory, which you elegantly took me back into my childhood to get the backstory. But the context is also their linguistic preference. Do they talk about problem or solution consistently? Do they talk about the past or the future? Do they talk about themselves as an individual? Do they talk about the group? Do they talk consistently about absolutes? So always, never, precisely. This is the context. But the context is also the political environment in which you operate in. And although you may work in an organisation that is a commercial organisation, you might say there's no politics in your organisation. There is, trust me. There's always politics.
Right.
And it could be something as simple as the adjectives they use in a conversation. And we'll come back to that shortly. Level 4, listening for their unsaid. So when you know the neuroscience, the maths of speaking, you can understand why what's unsaid is actually more important to listen to than what's described. So typically someone will speak in a range of 125 to 150 words per minute, but they can think nearly 9 times faster. They can think at 900 words per minute. So the very first thing they say is 14% of what they think and what they mean. So it means that most conversations have 86% of the conversation not said. That's why you kind of pick it up the next day and wonder, why didn't they discuss this? And then finally, level 5, listening for their meaning. What does it mean to them versus what they said? So quick summary, yourself, the content, the context, the unsaid, and then the meaning. Now, in our data that we've collected, most people's listening is actually at a level, 92% of people are at level 1 and level 2. So very few people are able to be conscious, to know that we got to go and explore what's unsaid. And yet it's, if you want to get that 1 hour, 4 hours back in your schedule, the unsaid is what stops you coming back at the next work in progress meeting and delivering something, and they say, that's not what I said. That's not what I asked for.
Right.
So for many of us, this is complicated by cultural and second language overlays. We're working with people who are not operating in their home languages. And a simple example of how people may operate completely differently is the way they relate to silence. Some cultures relate to silence completely differently to the way we relate to silence in the West. In the West, we go, the awkward silence, the deafening silence, the pregnant pause. There's all these negative implications of silence. Yet in high context cultures, in the indigenous cultures of Australia, in the Maori cultures of New Zealand, the Pacific Islander nations of the Maori communities, the Eskimo of North America, the cultures of North Asia, Korea, Japan, China, there's a completely different relationship with silence. Silence is a sign of wisdom, respect, and authority. Silence is a magnet that draws out what's missing in the conversation. And silence is, when you think of architecture, when you think about writing, when you think about art, when you think about music, great music is as much as the sound as it is the silence. And it's the choice where the silence is in there. So for many of us, if we're conscious of silence, we can draw out more of what's unsaid. Because silence is that great universal cross-cultural magnet that helps all of us to listen. Now, earlier on I mentioned I have dyscalculus, my relationship with numbers is not great. And if I said to you 3 is half of 8, you'd all be really confused, and your initial response is really simple. No, Oscar, you're wrong. 4 is half of 8. But what you've heard is what I've said, not what I think and what I mean. Now, if I was to draw the number 8, and if I was to fold the number 8 in half vertically,
he just has a hold of a piece of paper which has a big 8 on it.
And now,
and there's a 3.
and if I fold an 8 in half and then I kind of draw a line down the middle and I've got 2 3s. Now, what you don't realize, if I tore this piece of paper in half horizontally, I would have 2 zeros as well. So 0 is half of 8, 3 is half of 8, and 4 is half of 8. But because you're thinking in mathematics or arithmetic when I say 3 is half of 8 and not geometry, which is how I was meaning, all of a sudden you go, oh, they're wrong. How can I quickly understand how they're wrong? How can I tell them that they're wrong? How can I point out that they're wrong? Because you're not even conscious of the bias that comes about. There's a wonderful online assessment from Harvard University. Nearly 20 million people have taken this assessment. It's called the Association Bias Assessment. And it will tell you what gets in the way when it comes to your own unconscious bias. And what you'll have, Sophie, those listening right now will have situations in their workplace that people will come and say to them the equivalent of 3 is half of 8, and they go, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, right? And that's when you say they're wrong is your moment to pause and ask a question about what do they mean. And the question could be simply, tell me more. And when you ask them to tell you more, they'll explain how 3 is half of 8. And then all of a sudden, there's common understanding and opposing ideas can coexist. The only reason you think 4 is half of 8 is because that's your educational background, that's your family upbringing, that's your cultural background. We have a series of historical experience sets that we use to put a lens over every conversation, and it's an assumption filter. If your assumption filter says they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong, rather than explain to them why they're wrong, just be curious a little bit longer and go, let me ask them a little bit more about that.
As you say something, if it's not something that seems so obviously in a mathematical way, I'm taking the most standard assumption that you're doing a division. If it's something a little bit more complex than that, there may be lots of things running through my head in many different ways, and without necessarily a judgment being associated with them. But it still means that I'm not listening as actively to you, right? I'm kind of like, oh my God, oh, that's really interesting. And that sparks this idea and that idea. Because I cannot concentrate as well on what you're saying, as interesting as those sparks might be, how can I focus my energies practically to hang on your every word, I guess?
And again, hanging on every word doesn't make it good listening. Interrupting skillfully, professionally, elegantly can be as powerful a listening technique as most people confuse listening with therapy, where you have to be silent the whole time. You have to be passive. In that particular context, here's a question for you. If your questions and the things that are firing off in your mind in that moment, Sophie, are all about you and your understanding, that's interesting. But ask yourself this question. Does your question, does your curiosity further common understanding, the group understanding or the dialogue between the two of us? If it does, wait for them to finish their sentence. Don't cut someone off mid-sentence. And say, look, what you said is really important, powerful, fascinating, whatever adjective you want to use. I just want to check because I'm thinking about this. Are you thinking about the same thing or are you thinking about something different? Because we want to get to what they mean, not what they say the first time. And what happens is if we dialogue and we fire off on the 14% of what they've said, it could be the wrong 14%. It could be the unproductive 14%.
Okay.
So you're firing off and going, oh, yeah, that's a great idea, and I can build on that by doing this, this, this. Here's the one question most people don't ask at the beginning of every conversation. I'm going to talk about it in one-on-one sense. I'll explain how to do this in a group setting also. If you ask this question, meetings will be shorter. Meetings will have a common direction held by both participants and will give you permission to skillfully interrupt and shorten the meeting. This question, consistently used, changes the way the speaker expresses their idea and results in common understanding of the shared meaning, not just the shared saying what's being said. The beginning of each conversation, independent of any meeting agenda you may hold, is simply ask this question. And Sophie, you can count how many words. What would make this a great conversation?
Ooh.
Now, we ask what would make this a great conversation, not what would make this a great conversation for you. This is a common mistake that people make. They say, for you. We want to understand what will make this a great conversation for all participants, not just the person you just asked that question to. Now, whatever they say, it doesn't matter. This question is about how to have the conversation, not what we're going to discuss. So imagine I said to Sophie, what would make this a great conversation? Sophie would say something like, Oscar, I'd love you to tell stories to the audience that are practical and helpful for them in our conversation today. Great. I would check in regularly with Sophie and go, if it was a 1-hour meeting every 10 minutes, I would say, Sophie, at the beginning of our conversation, you said a good conversation would be lots of stories and practical advice. How are we going with that? And you would say,
excellent. Yes.
We're on track.
We're learning a lot.
We're on track. Now, if I wasn't, it would give you permission to tell me that.
Right.
Now, typically what our deep listening ambassadors tell us happens is this. If you check in with that question regularly, by the second time you ask the question, the counterpart will say something like, in about a third of cases, Oscar, got everything we need? We can wrap it up. So the meeting actually finishes much, much sooner because you've checked in and asked the question. The other thing that question does is signal to the person that you listened to what they said at the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
Similarly, this compass setting, if somebody gets into this big, long, repetitive story that you know they've told over and over and over again, you've got permission now because you can check in and interrupt them and go, hey, Sophie, at the beginning of the meeting, we said it was about practical, useful stories. How are we going with that?
It's shaggy dog, yeah.
Right? And all of a sudden they go, oh, yeah, okay, cool. So this simple question, what will make this a great conversation, is the north setting in our listening compass. Now, we can go north, south, east, and west in any conversation, but we're always going to come back to north. And north is a shared position. It's not your position or mine. It's the agreed common position. Now, what that does mean is if they don't ask you that question back, Sophie says to me, Oscar, so what will make this a good conversation? Then it's your role to say, hey, and for me, a good conversation would be, or for me, a good conversation would be just that. Fantastic. Now, with your listening compass in place, it gives you permission to interrupt. It gives you permission to clarify, and it does it in a way that's not judgmental. It's not felt like you've offended somebody, because you're using their words that they said at the beginning of the meeting. And it signals that the words you're using is highlighting you listened, and you can check in all the way along. Now, the flip side, as we get towards the back half of the meeting, and when I say the back half, if we're in an hour-long meeting, 40 minutes in, check that they've heard what you meant. Check to hear what they've heard is what you mean. Sophie, if we were to summarize this conversation for your manager, how would you summarize it in a few sentences? Sophie, if you were to summarize this conversation as a subject line in an email, how would you summarize it? All of a sudden, you will hear what they heard, not what you said, what they heard. And when you do that with 20 minutes to go, you've got time left to do something about it if they're way off track.
Right.
And if they're on track, again, it's fantastic. And particularly if you're any kind of consulting, support function, human resources, accounting, finance, or you're in a sales profession, this question is really, really helpful because you know if your message has been heard and you know how helpful you've been. And again, if they've heard what you've said and what you've meant, meeting over, or pick another agenda item and use the remaining 20 minutes there. So that's a long way to answer your single question, but I hope it's been helpful.
It certainly has. I think there are many leaders for whom asking such a question would not necessarily come naturally. How does one encourage, or is there foundational groundwork that is helpful to have in an organization, or cultural elements that you typically recognize where leaders can launch those type of questions more easily in the conversation?
Now, if you were to say that in one sentence, subject line in an email, Sophie?
I was trying to be so diplomatic. How do you get leaders to want to ask that question?
Yeah. And I think your second question has got a very different emphasis to the first question. Do you think that's true? Because it seemed like there was a lot of padding and kind of words around it to make it feel good.
Yes. I was trying to be diplomatic, but okay.
Yeah. So here's an interesting, and you can edit this out or leave it in. It's up to you. I think the really interesting question right now is question 1 or question 2 more useful for your audience?
That is a good question. I hope they're the same question. I think what I was adding was my trying to be empathetic about how much leaders have to change. That's where I was coming from. I think the direct question that is useful to listeners is the second question.
And what you've just discovered is the 125-900 rule. What you said the first time was not what you meant. You had to have 2 goes to get out what you meant. It's just a really practical example of a dialogue where there were lots of words in the first question, yet the second question was very precise and helpful for the audience.
I completely understand what you're saying. I guess I was trying to give context in the first question, because the second question I feel could be misinterpreted in terms of my meaning, in terms of how blunt that seemed. And yes, it went on way too long the first time. I guess I was trying to give some of the backstory, which I could have been much more brief about.
Okay, so my speculation is, again, what I want a role model. The answer is not A and B. The answer is a hybrid between the two of them. So let's do question 3. What's the hybrid question?
Oh my goodness. This is such high pressure for me. Okay. So the hybrid 3 is leadership is evolving in many ways. How can leaders make the change they need to ask this question as naturally as possible?
So the first thing is to notice whether you're asking questions as a leader. The second thing that will be helpful for you as a leader is notice, are your questions internally orientated or externally orientated? Typically, when you're dealing with internal meetings, you're going to be asking a lot of internal questions. The new muscle to develop, the new muscle to flex is simply to explore questions of thinking about this from our regulator's perspective, thinking about this from our competitor's perspective, thinking about this from the perspective of the customer, thinking about this from the perspective of future generations, and then pose whatever question you want to ask. This will orientate both yourself and the group to an external perspective. And when you do, so even if the perspective is external with regard to customers, ask the question in regard to competitors, or ask the question in regard to customers in completely different geographies, or ask the question in regard to customers in a completely different time, a long time further forward in the future. Thinking about our customers in 3 years rather than 3 months, how will they have different questions for us? So the first step as a leader is, if you're just reloading more bullets into your argument, that's great for you. Is it helping the group? Is it helping the group to make decisions when you're not there? Because managers get results when they're present and leaders get results when they're absent. And the best way to get results when you're absent is to have consistent questions that you might pose. This signals humility on your part. It signals curiosity. It signals flexibility. It signals openness. And it stimulates a debate where competing ideas can coexist, where we extract the best from each of them.
Okay, so I've exposed myself in this interview. This has been great. Oscar, what haven't I asked you that I should have done?
I think that's a helpful question. And I think the powerful question is, what's the question the audience would be screaming at us and asking us right now? I think that's more useful than the question I would come up with, which I've got lots. That is probably not helpful for the audience.
Well, I also ask, what is the one thing that people can do tomorrow to start listening? That's my last question. So if there's something before that you think is maybe another one of those questions, thinking about it in the context of these times, which are so unpredictable, do you have any particular recommendations specifically in this environment to improve people's listening comprehension when there's a lot of virtual and hybrid meetings?
Most of us aren't aware we have a listening battery.
A listening battery. Okay.
A lot of us go into conversations with our listening battery at red, about to hit black. So our capacity to listen is finite.
Okay.
Sometimes, based on all the meetings you've had, it now might not be the best time to listen to the conversation. And you may need to renegotiate. Sophie, I've just found out my dad's had a stroke and I need to reschedule this meeting. I hope you understand. That was a real situation that happened to me 2 years ago, where I had to speak to somebody and explain to them that I'm about to head out to see my dad and take him to a hospital because I think he's had a stroke. A lot of us don't have the courage to admit that our listening batteries are drained. Orange, red, touching on shutdown. So the first thing to do is notice your listening battery in any conversation before you start and during the conversation as well. Notice what drains your battery. Notice what charges your battery. So I'll give you a handful of tips to make sure your listening battery is optimum. Now, just as it comes to our cell phone battery, we can't always have it perfectly green, but let's get it closer to yellow than it is to red. So tip number one, if you're the host of the meeting, do not start the meeting at the top of the hour. Start the meeting at 5 minutes after the hour or 5 minutes after the half hour. Why? Well, what happens is this. If you start the meeting at the top of the hour, people will arrive at 2, 3, 4 minutes after the hour. Hey, Oscar, sorry I'm late. I've been in back-to-back meetings, but I'm here now and I'm ready for the conversation. You're physically here and in a virtual environment, you're logged in, but mentally, you're still back there. And it's going to take you 2 to 3 minutes to process the next meeting. As opposed to, hey, Oscar, love coming to your meetings. 5 minutes after the hour, I love it. I've had time to get a glass of water. I've had time to visit the restroom. I've even had time to grab a snack. I'm ready to go. Now, both people are arriving at roughly the same time, 5 after the hour, but you're setting up a container so that your listening battery and their listening battery is charged. In that 5 minutes, you can do those physical things, drink water, take 3 deep breaths, which will charge your batteries. If you're the host of the meeting, again, if you're starting, I know you can't set all your meetings. Everybody else is setting meetings up at the top of the hour. You'll just have to manage around that. Now, by the way, don't make your meeting 1 hour, make it 50 minutes, and don't make your meeting half an hour, make it 20 minutes, because if you use what will make this a great conversation question right up front, meeting's going to go quicker anyway. The power tip, this is the equivalent of the supercharger for your cell phone. Listen to 3 minutes of music before you go into a virtual meeting.
Okay. Any particular music?
Yeah. The music should be any music to start off with. But if you're really conscious of the kind of music you want to do, is simply this. The pace of the music should match the outcome of the meeting you're attending. So for me, as an example, if I'm delivering a virtual keynote, I'm going to be listening to a song that's at 150 beats per minute. Fort Minor, remember the name. That's the song I use for that purpose.
Okay.
There's an 8-minute song that has no words in it at all. It's called Weightless by Marconi Union. It's an instrumental. And when I have to work with clients on really deep, complex, one-on-one situations around long-term problems, I don't listen for 3 minutes. I listen for 8 minutes. Oh. And if it's a workshop and the energy I want to bring is called Easy by Groove Armada, that's at about 125 beats per minute. And again, in each case, it's matching the energy I need to bring to serve the group. Now, until then, just play your favorite song because the matching is a bit fancy pants. But in those cases, it will recharge your listening battery really, really quickly because you're using and shutting down the browser tabs that you have open or trying to hold ideas from the last meeting and just allow you to do that. If you're logging into virtual meetings, try as much as possible for those 5 minutes beforehand. Go for a walk, get out of your chair, get out of the room you're in for that virtual meeting and arrive 2 minutes before the meeting, but use those 3 minutes to do some physical activity as well. Again, that will help to recharge your listening batteries. So my big tip is listening battery. Know you've got one. Listening is processed at the front of the brain. It's using an area called working memory in the prefrontal cortex. And if we can recharge our listening battery, we can help them as well as help us shorten the meeting.
Thank you so much. That is incredibly helpful. I'm loving the idea of having shorter meetings and asking shorter questions and giving the context of my question beforehand. Now that puts the pressure on me going forward in podcast interviews because listeners should be listening to this and then recognizing that I need to be practicing that going forward. Okay, I'm going to try. Thank you for putting me on the spot and thank you for making me learn quickly. It wasn't easy, for sure, and I have a lot of progress to make. Oscar, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you have. I have listened hard.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you again very much to Oscar Trimboli, author of How to Listen, podcast host of Deep Listening, on his quest to create 100 million deep listeners. You can find out more about your listening barriers at listeningquiz.com. Immediate action tip. Before you go into a virtual meeting, use 3 minutes to charge your listening battery by listening to music. The tempo should match the outcome you want. At the same time, also get up out of your chair, go for a walk. Listening is a core skill that overlaps with and is part of empathy. To be able to understand someone else's perspective and check you are correctly recognizing their feelings. If you are interested to find out more about listening and empathy, you can also read or listen to my book, Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage in the new era of work. If you enjoy this podcast, please write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research, and information, do follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @SophieWade, and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on LinkedIn. Until next time.